such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. Use the just in the spread of case, coherent yet unknown name. Oh, can you put me in coach? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on one side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Hey everyone, welcome
guys.
to Apocalypse Here, Christianity you can live with. We've got a group of people on our open stream this evening, and it looks like quite a big crowd in the chat already,
Yeah,
which is
good
great.
to see everybody. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. This is our open stream on Christian nationalism.
Is there a way for people to get in the chat if they want to talk?
Yes,
to us?
if you'd like to get in the chat, or not in the chat, in the on the open stream, I can send a link to you. And I think it'll be safe enough if I send it in the chat and then kind of
Police.
filter through once
Yeah.
they're in the quote unquote green room. So yeah, if you'd like to come on and be on the open stream, just let us know in the chat and I can send you the link. Yeah, so we're talking about Christian nationalism. This how did this kind of get birthed in on our channel?
Well, we did the Bonhoeffer show. Well, you did the Bonhoeffer
Yeah.
show. I remember we were talking, and I said that we needed to find somebody who could do a show about why what's wrong with Eric Metaxas's Bonhoeffer, and that got us talking about like the book Battle for Bonhoeffer and some sort of like classic or some particularly successful recent work on Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And then that came out, I think, just before the Capitol insurrections. I might be right. I don't know if I'm sure about that.
I think it was right before
that. So it just seemed like, this is a really good time to talk about what this Christian nationalism thing is. It's been in the news a lot, I think, in particular. I think sort of the same sorts of sets of people who have been very, anti critical race theory in the church this has been sort of the new boogeyman of, oh my gosh, we can't talk about Christian nationalism. But I think that this is definitely a force to be reckoned with in American politics and American social life and American theology. So I thought this would be a good issue for us to talk about. The cat is caught in my thread. So I thought this might be a worthwhile thing to talk about and deal with. So yeah.
Great.
Let's launch right in.
Yeah, before we do that, let's go around and have folks introduce themselves. Ruben, I don't think you've been on this channel specifically. I know I've been on an open stream with you before, I think on Spartan's channel.
Yeah.
And Elvir, I don't know have you been on this one or was that with Spartan? No, so Elvir's new as well. Spartan's been on here way too many times. So let's start with Elvir. Elvir, just do a brief introduction about who you are.
Yeah. Elvir, I'm a husband. I'm a puppy daddy. I graduated with my MDiv from Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach, Florida. I currently live in Kentucky, East Kentucky. I'm the director of Family Life Ministries, at a First Christian Disciples of Christ Church.
Nice.
I am currently now a Master's of Theology student at Yellowstone Theological Institute. I do it online.
Loves America. Clearly.
Yeah, loving the patriotism.
My family, we are refugees, so there's my little.
From where?
Oh yeah.
Bosnia, former Yugoslavia.
Okay, yeah,
Gotcha.
absolutely.
Should have known by
Hence
the
weird
name.
name.
Yeah, should have known by the name. Yeah. Well, thanks for being on here, Elvira.
Thank you for having me.
Ruben, tell us who you are. Oh, you're muted, Ruben.
Sorry about that.
No,
Yeah, hi. So my name is Ruben, and I'm just a regular guy, right? I'm happily married. I'm a Christian, happily married, and spent most of my adult life as an atheist. Actually, I grew up in a Catholic household, and it just never felt like just the way my family lived, especially the extended family, just never felt genuine. So rejected God pretty early as a young teen, and lived my life as an atheist, and did the traditional classic thing of mocking religious people, in particular Christianity, right? And I lived a pretty, what would be easily defined as a pretty evil, sinful life, and wasn't bringing any good fruit from that. Twice divorced, cheated on both of my ex-wives, and all that kind of stuff. And then God put my now forever wife in my life, and she was already a Christian, and she just really challenged my ethics and my moral system, which was very surprising because nobody ever did that before. And and anyway, long story short on that is, I got saved. God equipped my wife to save me, and I have a great walk with God, and I'm very passionate about my faith, and I have a fledgling channel called Placebo Effect, where I'm taking an apologetics approach, but kind of in a classic way that the New Testament writes, where it's like we want to just kind of defend our faith. And because I'm just a layperson, I'm not coming from a philosophical expertise or an academia sense, but just more of kind of practical world relatability way. And so I actually, was kind of interesting because I just did an episode very recently talking about, like, one thing I'm just really sick and tired of is Christians that are trying to align patriotism or your political ideology with Christianity. And like, if you keep your eyes centered on Christ, then none of that stuff really plays a part in any of that. So
sure, it's great to have you on.
Thanks
Ruben.
for telling us your story.
Yeah,
thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for reaching out to have me send you the link. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Ethan, who are you?
Yeah, I've been on here a few times. I'm Ethan, married, have a channel called Spartan Theology, and yeah, that's about all I really need to share. I've been on here a few times, so if you want to learn more about me, join one of my open streams or something. That's probably the best way.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
All right. Laura, do you want to kick this off?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a cat kind of on and off my lap for a second.
Yeah,
there,
Flannery
so
will show up. I know Avi was wondering about Flannery. Yeah, I would like to meet Flannery.
Apparently
You
not.
saw her tail. Yeah, she's gone now.
Flannery would rather not meet you.
No.
So
yeah, it's good that we have the this digital kind of boundary between us and all of you. When this cat
protect
is in the
you
room.
from this
She is
cat.
terrible.
Yeah. No, so I thought we would the book that I recently read on this subject that I found particularly
you have it?
we've lost connection.
Oh,
with
okay,
camera.
just keep talking.
Okay. The book that I've recently read on this subject that I found particularly illuminating is Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry's book, Taking Back America for God. This is a very recent sociological study done by two sociologists of religion. One is Samuel is at IUPUI, I believe, and I can't remember where Dr. Whitehead is.
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma.
University of Oklahoma.
Gotcha,
Yeah.
Oklahoma. And if I tagged them both in the announcement of this show. So if you guys are on here, thanks for all you do. You guys really, really pulled out the stops on this book. But they basically did like a quantitative study on what kinds of beliefs inform Christian nationalism, how many people actually are Christian nationalists, whether or not these things correspond with the extent to which these things correspond with beliefs about heteronormativity and patriarchy and male domination, basically, along with nativism and white supremacy. So they have a definition of Christian nationalism that I thought we would just start off by saying, this is what we're talking about. This is from page 10 of their book. Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. This particular definition of Christianity we're working with includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. Christian nationalists contend that America has been and it should always be distinctively Christian, particularly in the way that Christianity was described above as a heteronormative, nativist religion. Strong associations between the role of Israel in the Old Testament and the role of America now, the sort of chosen nation narrative, particularly with a militaristic ethnic purity component. And then informing beliefs include political conservatism. There really is no such thing as like a far-right Christian nationalism at this point in the United States. Biblicism, so that's sort of the mixes of biblical inerrancy and sort of this literal interpretation idea that tends to inform that. Belief that the nation is on the brink of moral collapse. Belief that God wants his people to be warlike for good. Belief that the nation was founded on biblical and Christian principles. That the United States has a special relationship with God among all the nations on earth. And particularly that our national prosperity, I'm saying our, I don't know if everyone in the chat actually is American.
Yeah, Rob's not.
Rob's not. Hi, Rob, sorry. But and believe that the prosperity of the United States depends on faithfulness to God in this particular construction of biblical values. So that's basically what we're talking about. We're talking about Christian nationalism. That's what this is.
That's kind of a basic kind of starting point. And we can, of course, kind of talk about nuancing that in certain ways. But before we do, Rob, welcome.
Hi, Rob. Good to see you.
Thanks for coming.
Hey, guys. God bless everyone. Nice to see you.
For sure. Do you want to give just a quick introduction of who you are for the folks out there?
I'm just your typical Australian.
Just a dude.
That's a dude down under. Currently, believe it or not, suffering with an unusual circumstance despite COVID. So last year, you guys know about the Australian fires, but that was over east.
Oh yeah.
Now it's swapped the other way. Now it's,
oh no,
because I'm west, so it's happening the same size. It's happening literally at my doorstep. And
oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
So far, no evacuation needed just yet, but
well,
I can smell the smoke.
Our cat just knocked off the computer. Yeah, really sorry to hear about that.
I'm
Rob.
really sorry to hear that. Yeah,
it's just one of those. Australians sort of just, we have a little bit of humor. We're like, our dunny is on fire. Like that's usually the conclusions we're making. So dunny here is toilet. So.
Learning some Elvira's like, I don't know what that means. Learning some slang. So in the light of what Laura just said, do we have any sort of initial kind of thoughts about
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Elvira.
So something that was a long definition, so I forget where it was in there, but it mentioned like being proud to be a native or something.
Nativism, yeah.
Nativism. Yeah. What is that? What does that entail, especially in America?
Good question.
Yeah, basically, nativism is sort of a definition of national identity that corresponds really strongly with having with long roots in the United States. And, I mean, ironically enough, this tends to not really correspond very strongly with thinking that Native Americans are the real Americans, but sort of a definition of what it means to be American that, one thing that Perry and Whitehead talk about a lot in their book is that there's a Christian nationalism carries this sort of basic assumption that what it means to be really American and that a person can never be truly American unless they are also Christian. And also to some extent the opposite direction, that people are not really Christian unless they practice a very American inflected style of Christianity. And basically the whole nativism thing is the same idea. The idea that a recent immigrant or a second generation immigrant is not American in the same way that someone whose family has been here for a really long time. So.
Thank you.
So that's that might be a cultural discourse you're particularly familiar with by virtue of being. Are you first generation or second generation, Elvir?
First
Generation. Yeah.
I was born in Germany.
I gotcha.
I am Bosnian. But
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
when they left, they had me. So they left before they had me.
Gotcha.
So it's a lot less my story and more theirs. But
obviously it still affects you quite a bit. I think being raised by parents with the
Just a bit.
being raised by parents coming from the refugee experience, that
Right,
obviously that changes parenting styles quite a bit. But so I've been told.
it's actually pretty funny. So I tell people when we first came here, we lived in California early on, and we lived in I lived in South LA, San Pedro, and we were surrounded by Hispanic folk.
Yeah.
So all my friends were Hispanic, and all of us young children were learning English at the same time, but from different directions. So from Spanish and then Bosnian. So we learned English together, but it was just I was super white. I don't know.
That's an interesting component of the English as second language learning experiences. That's an unusual 90s Bosnian, the Bosnian side of things, such a 90s situation. But anyways, that's not gonna.
Ruben,
So-
I think
so,
you were wanting
Yeah,
to chime in.
I was just going to chime in because you'd kind of said that we have kind of some opening thoughts to that synopsis, and then Laura just made a very interesting statement with, that nationalism kind of being conflated with that you've got to basically have kind of a Western idealism bolted onto that to be a quote true Christian or whatever. And I was just reading a book by Lee Strobel, and I don't remember who he was interviewing, but the thing that was fascinating about that is the big disconnect with Christianity's observance in the West versus how it is in what I would call the emerging markets or the growing nations, right? And one of the concerns that I have, right, and that I just kind of want to set the table maybe if it becomes more organic in thought later, but I think the concern with what you said, Laura, is that we have this kind of boilerplate standard of how people are being raised up as ministers to evangelize, especially abroad. And I think the danger is those that will continue to couple those two together and be like, not only you have to be Christian and let me tell you about the Bible, let me also tell you like what it's like, Americanism flavor, you know what I mean? And I think that's a very dangerous game in terms of spreading the good news, right? So
no, absolutely, I absolutely agree with that. I think that's definitely an issue with missions from the American side of things, right? So absolutely.
Any other thoughts on sort of the initial definition of what we're going to be working with?
Is this sorry?
Yeah,
go for it. Yeah.
Is this is American or Christian nationalism like a type of civil religion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely how I would understand it. Or it encompasses American civic religion. That there's this, particularly this post Cold War and post Cold War understanding of the way in which Christian symbols exist in public life. A lot of this stuff emerged specifically in response to the Soviet Union, right? That this was seen as sort of this this atheistic empire, this non-religious empire, and in addition to being, they're Soviet, we're capitalist, they're East, we're West. They are atheistic, we are Judeo-Christian, I think is particularly the phrase that emerged to describe this, that we're loosely Western monotheistic, but also really Christian, but we're also just sort of like sublimating these, sublimating Jews under the heading, even though most elements of this don't really seem to have anything to do with Judaism at all. So I definitely think that's I think the civic religion thing is really interesting. Like what does it mean to open Congress with a prayer, for instance, right? Sorry, or a woman
Sorry.
There is some justifiable laughs, I think. Yeah. Well, like, what does it mean to open Congress with a prayer? What does it mean to, like teacher-led prayers were dispensed with in a Supreme Court case in the 1960s, but people have, for the large part, often a lot of Christian nationalists have argued to bring them back. And again, these are not really distinctly historical Christian prayers. People aren't asking for the Lord's Prayer to be read at the beginning of class. It's just sort of this generalized Christian inflected American theism, right? So I think that definitely interacts with Christian nationalism in a lot of ways. That there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's funny to think about that, actually. When you look at the history of the history of the Supreme Court and in legal challenges to school-led prayer. Early on, a lot of the earliest contenders of this were actually other Christians who really resisted the idea that Christian prayer, that there's anything noble in leading a generic prayer that may or may not be sincerely meant from the classroom. That this really wasn't something that was particularly God-honoring from a Christian perspective, and I completely agree with that. I can't tell you how many sporting events I've been to in Indiana where we lead off with a prayer that's just sort of to nobody, because it can't be to Jesus, because we're
the generic God.
Yeah, generic God. Yeah, the demiurge, I guess, is what
the off-brand,
right. Sorry.
The off-brand God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Kroger brand God. Yeah, no, that's
Is it fair to bring the counterbalance to the discussion, or not? And I guess maybe
say whatever you want, man. Or
So I guess kind of one of the things, right? Well, I think the Christian nationalism brand definitely, I think, is going to have a negativism to it, and probably rightfully so in its coinage because of all the stuff we already have illustrated. But I think maybe the counterbalance is what I've noticed on the opposite side in the secular space is that whole like separation of church and state, almost to the point to where they're trying to have a revisionist history approach to it, like, well, this is a country that's not theocratic, therefore, right, you shouldn't like assume there's Christian values in this nation. But that's a mistake, because historically, right, this nation began with Protestant settlers that were escaping persecution from the church, and there is that framework of Judeo-Christian value systems like interwoven within the framers themselves, although many of them were probably deists. But that aside, right, I'm just saying that like we were not founded as an atheistic society, so I think that's the counterbalanced, right?
No, and I do. I mean, I think it's complicated, right? Like settlers who came to the United States started settlements for commercial and religious reasons, and then there are a few different religions going on between Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Georgia, and then of course there are the people who were already here, right? Who weren't Christian, Native Americans. So I mean, obviously, so I think on one hand, like there's some complication with America's religious history on that front, but one thing I do think is fair to push back on is what kind of a society should we be trying to produce in the United States? I think one thing that happens when you look at Europe, where you see this sort of a norm that it's the goal of it's the responsibility of the state to produce like a secular state, that actually can be really illiberal in some really not great ways. I think, I think about France and, like niqab bans and headscarf bans. Like the idea that if you want your universities to be strictly secular, that actually can get really oppressive really quickly, particularly to religious minorities. So I think that, I obviously I have absolutely no sympathy with the Christian nationalistic project, but I do really strongly resist the idea that an enforced secular state is ultimately more liberative, right? I think that's clearly incorrect, and really can, trample on the rights of particularly religious minorities, but religious people in general. So I think those are the competing tensions I see there.
I think one of the traps that people can make, and this goes back to how I just try to explain things from a relatability perspective, is I almost found myself kind of going in that direction, and thank goodness, like I had a lot of gut checks to keep me balanced. But I think one of the mistakes that happens is, right, there's this whole, like, for people that might like really love this country a lot, and not to say that's a bad thing, like there's nothing really wrong with that, but
Yeah.
right, when we go to just what the framer stated, that all men are created equal, and it's then our rights are inalienable, and those give attributes towards God, as if like God endowed us with those principles. And while yes, from a creation perspective, absolutely we may be created equal, but the fact that like our rights like come from God, and the government and nor nobody else should take them away from it, I would say that the Bible probably says that the state has a lot of different things to say about that. And a specific example that I wanted to share from relatability is like the two-way argument. And not that I want to go there, but just saying that like I was a veteran and I felt a certain particular way to try to defend that, and be like, no, we should want to like defend what was in the Constitution and yada yada. But then I started realizing this, like the more I got into like defending that, then it became where now I could start to blatantly feel the conflict of like, well, turn the other cheek. And what does Jesus say to Peter about, live by the sword, die by the sword? It's like, should I really be trying to defend guns here and align that with my value system as a Christian? The answer is no, right? So
Yeah.
I've luckily backed off that edge, right? But I think a lot of people that are strong patriots start leading in this direction before you know it, boom, Christian nationalist, right?
Yeah. No, and I think that's one place where you see one of the most corrosive effects of Christian nationalism is that things that are values in state law or in the Constitution are kind of assumed to be inherently Christian, when in fact Christianity pushes back on them quite a bit. Like why is the Pentagon such a huge part of the national budget? This is not a Christian value. Having like a really well-established Department of Defense has nothing to do with Christian history or Christian values. It's something that we do because of the post-war international scene. This is within America's interest, but it's our job as Christians to think critically about, okay, well, what does this mean? Is this ethical? How do we think about this? Can we participate in it? And I'm not trying to...
Those have been questions that Christians have been asking themselves for a long time.
Right,
in the States, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Do we participate in this? And I'm not saying that resisting that is necessarily good. I'm just saying that it's been a viable Christian position to be conscientious objectors in those sorts of scenarios, right?
Let's start. Do you mind if I just kind of start with an open-ended question just to bring everybody into this? Okay, should Christians be patriotic? And maybe define patriotic when you say yes or no.
Yes.
Elder's on top of it already. We know your answer.
But yeah, should Christians be patriotic?
Well, no. I mean, the Jews were nationalists, so in a sense, it's not a bad thing, right? But I think as long as you don't put that above Christ, then there's no harm in it.
I think when I consider the kingdom of God and what Paul does with Jew and Gentile relations, he brings in cultures, right? Maybe not everything from all the cultures, but it still incorporates cultures.
Yes, right.
And so my question would be, why not? Aren't politics basically just part of culture? Because not all politics are the same. Just like not all cultures or religions are the same, but you still, I don't know. That's kind of what I wrestle with, is that connection.
There's sort of an inherent good in multiculturalism, and that people are going to feel attachments to their own cultures, of course. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I think, Rob, what do you think? Let's get everybody in here.
Ultimately, I'd say no. Like ultimately, I'm becoming too strong of a fanboy of Jesus and his kingdom, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, the more I grow in the faith and all that, but I guess at the same time, there is the biblical mandate, 1 Timothy 2, Romans 13, this notion of prayers, supplications, thanksgiving to your leaders, and all that. So, for example, I find it interesting that the gospel has actually in a very interesting way calibrated the way I view, say, my country and my kinsfolk, the country, my brothers and sisters in, say, Australia, in the sense that, I should be patriotic in the sense that I'm a contributor in a democracy for the well-being of not only my country but for my neighbor. That again, biblical mandate: love your neighbor as yourself, all that stuff. And so, in that sense, yeah, by all means, I will, quote unquote, put my family first, I guess, or put my country first because I'm in it. The fruit of my labor goes towards the maintenance of this country. But at the same time, that's all at the horizontal secular playing field, which is, in my opinion, it's sort of my realization that it's neutral. It's not anti-religious or pro-religious. It's just, I'm alive on this part of the world, and don't be an ass. and then the Christian thing is like icing on the cake on top of that calibrates how I meant to then not just be that good individual in my own country, but sort of go, okay, but guess what? There's also Jesus that's part of that whole, that makes me be what I am. So yeah, that's how I would approach it.
If I can be so bold as to speculate, Rob, I kind of wonder if your German roots are showing a little bit here. Yeah. I think that, because I know that your grandparents were German, and I kind of wonder if, I think German Christians have a lot to teach us about healthy skepticism towards the state, like as a country that has, I think, processed a lot of national trauma and done a lot of national soul seeking about what the role of patriotism and nationalism is, way more successfully than America has ever done on a large scale, I think. So I wonder if that's your German roots showing a little bit, but
it's possible. I mean, I grew up in India, and obviously
right.
That's where my grandparents met, my parents met.
Yeah.
And so I am multicultural in that sense. And let's just say, I hate to say this, but there is a very subtle, even in the more Eastern culture that we were in growing up, there is a subtle racist attitude, like looking down upon the non-white. And, Rob, don't, literally, I'm not kidding, don't marry into a non-white or non-European, thing. And I hate that. I hate that with all my guts. And so
you're preaching to the choir. That's a Bosnian culture.
Really?
Like our people is here. They'll use the hard R for black folk. All that. I grew up with that shit.
Yeah.
So
but at the same time, I've conversed with them about in fact I have sort of changed. I guess you could say my more closer family sort of, they've seen my perspective now, and I just remind them, like, look, you're Christians, for goodness sake. You shouldn't be thinking in that way. And so at least they've given me the freedom to be expressive and to choose how I would like to live my life. At least they've given me that. But in return, I'll say, but then I'm also subject to Jesus. And
right. Let's go, Ethan, since he hasn't really chimed in much, and then Elvir.
I just think like patriotism, like especially like right now in America, is like such a crazy thing or whatever. Like I'm just old enough to remember, like, obviously around 9/11, everybody was patriotic, like that was just the thing. Like, I mean, it just, everybody was. It was, you saw somebody with American flag, it was like, yeah, this person's probably pretty legit or whatever. And like the past 4 years, it's like it has turned into like, if you have American flag, you're a Republican. Like that's essentially all it is. It was like almost racist to like fly an American, like viewed as racist or whatever, to fly an American flag. So it's really like skewed so much about like what it means to be patriotic, for sure. To me, it's like so hard to, it's such a weird thing. Like I think like being patriotic, like if you're politically involved and like you see good things that your country is doing, like there's no reason not to be proud of those things, like, okay, we pushed for this or whatever, and I think it's a good thing, so I don't know why you shouldn't. But like in America, it's really like the past 4 years it's it means something completely different than what I think it ever meant to be patriotic. Like it's literally like you're supporting as a person almost at this point. To like, if you like, yeah, to have like a truck with an American flag sticker on it or whatever, like you can basically know a lot about. I don't try not to judge people, but I can say that like if you see that, you kind of know like a little bit about that person, and that's really strange that like we all live in America, we're all Americans, but yet like it's turned into like this divisive thing to like someone dressed like Elvie or whatever. Like if I didn't know you or whatever, I would assume you're like a Trump MAGA nutcase or something.
I do have a truck.
Yeah.
And it has American flags all over it.
Well, and that's, part of this is also.
Oh, or maybe it's me, but I can't hear anything.
Oh, sorry. I also think part of this is the very specific co-opting of national symbols for a very specific political end. You know, thinking about like the 1776 report, you know, sort of a last gasp of the Trump administration, the idea that they were going to create this like patriotic curriculum to inspire like actual love in the country, which is basically like, you know, a very, not just a, you know, yeah. So you're using these very like classic patriotic symbols like 1776 and like America and loving your country, but also using it specifically to legitimize like not just a flattering picture of history, but also like a very conservative friendly one, you know? I think there is definitely some issue there with, you know, what is being co-opted, and that, you know, there are still, you know, being patriotic doesn't mean you're conservative. But you know, a lot of people who want to incorporate those images would kind of rather it felt that way. Right. So yeah, I think that's complicated. No, I think patriotism to some extent, yeah, Ruben, you're right. It was an attempt to counter the 1619 project, which, you know, I think there's some legitimate pushback by historians on elements of that. But, you know, the sort of, you know, I think generally any legitimate historian would say that, you know, history is not really, if history makes you repeat like exclusively proud and happy and comfortable, it's probably not really history, right? You know, history is very complicated and often very upsetting because that's what humans are like. No, I generally think I think to some extent patriotism is a very natural feeling. I think people generally like where they're from. I think people like their hometowns. I think people like their home states. So I think some particular attachment to your home country makes sense. It seems to me that, like, you know, if I had to describe what patriotism means to me and how I feel about it, you know, I think patriotism is wanting what's best for your country, right? So I think that from a nationalistic perspective, I think that means whatever my country wants it should have, whatever its leadership wants it should have. But from like a
right, which is very different,
right? But from like an absolutist or like a Christian standpoint, it's the best thing for the country is for it to be moral and charitable and good and giving, you know? So I think that's kind of where I see those definitions in tension with each other.
Yeah. Elvire.
So,
go ahead.
So like, I'm of the mind that like Christian subculture isn't the best thing probably for most Christians. But my question is, what is the culture of the kingdom of God? Or can we say there is one? Yeah.
Great question. What is the culture of the kingdom of God? Yeah. What does that mean?
Because I know I thought of that because of you, Rob, mentioning being under Jesus whilst living, you know, not letting your German roots take over, you know, trying to let Jesus speak into that. But like what's the demarcation? I don't know if there needs to be one or if there is one. Like what's the control of that?
You mean, to put another way, is there a way? Are you asking if so there are Christians like in dominion theology that try and force heaven on earth in their own way? Are you asking sort of similar to that? Like, is But in other words, is there a legitimate way to do a type of dominion theology?
So not in the abstract. So like concretely, are there controls or methods of like discernment? Like, well, first of all, can we say there's a culture, a specific culture to the kingdom of God? And then secondly, how do we use that culture to critique the other culture? Like, for example, you wouldn't, you said you're German.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think I'm just spitballing here, like what's coming to my mind. So for example, I can think of when Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, he's like, to the Greek, I'm as if a type of Greek to the Greek, or to the Jew, I'm a type of Jew to the Jew. But then he clarifies that, and literally in parentheses, he's like, oh, but by the way, I'm subject to Jesus. And there's a very subtle, he's a Jew, don't forget, and he proudly boasts of his Jewishness. And then he seems to not be afraid to disconnect himself from that otherwise very, very finite, worldly, nationalistic thing, because at the end of the day, he's subject to Jesus, who is, when he came on the planet, a Jew. And yet it's interesting how they sort of diverge attention away from the Jewishness of Jesus, because he's more than that, because he's the Son of God. And so in that sense, if you're becoming an adopted child of God, it's you can't then fit into one category or something. You're like now an adopted child of God. That's how I'm seeing the Christian scriptures in that sense. I don't know. Like, I don't know if anyone else has. If anyone here disagrees with that, I'm interested to hear your point of view. But
I think I'm trying to think, not necessarily disagree or agree with what you said, Rob, but like kind of going off what Elvira said. So I grew up in South Carolina, and I like my family was from New Jersey, so we like kind of were a little bit of like outcasts. Like my family was like nominally Catholic, so we'd like go to Catholic church, but never really took it seriously. But I just say all that to say like there was a very strong like Christian subculture in like my schools and stuff. Like I would say as of now, like I haven't been back there in a while, but I'm sure a lot of them would fit into what we're talking about, this Christian nationalism now. And I don't know, I'm like thinking about how like that was very like divisive or cliquey, or like it was very hard to like join in, and it really kept me away. Like that was a big reason why I think I never became a Christian. It's just because like becoming a Christian like clearly meant like being very like just a certain type of culture where, and it was very American. And now then like when I moved to Texas, in Houston especially, is very diverse. So like it wasn't so much of that. Like there are, I'm sure, plenty of groups like that here. I mean, I know there are. Obviously, my wife's parents are like that, but the places like that we hang around were much more diverse, and like it just wasn't that way. So becoming like that's what really like opened me up to like, okay, Christianity is not just becoming like a red-blooded American who jacks up his truck, like it doesn't have anything to do with that. And like that's what really opened me up to actually hearing the gospel and becoming a Christian. So like I see the dangers in it. That's what I'm trying, and it's like weird to think like what is the like quote unquote Christian culture or whatever, because they're like it's one thing to like there are different morals and ideals that we hold to for sure, but then again it's like you don't want to be like exclusive or whatever. I don't know, it's a very like tough line, because you're like you want to fit in, because there's like we're all people too. Like I've been really like I've dove in my faith more and more because of people that are like very open and honest. Like we're like these people that aren't Christians, like the way they act is not just because like they're these evil people or whatever, and like as soon as they find God they completely change or whatever. Like a lot of it is just people putting on a face. And so like there's I don't know, it's like it's a very fine line. I think I'm like kind of going off topic a little bit, but it's just hard to like what Christian culture really like should look like. I guess is kind of what Elvier's question was, and it's really tough to know that. Yeah.
Just quickly, what's interesting? This is sort of me coming from a more science background.
Mm-hmm.
I recently debated a young creationist on the question: is evolution inherently racist? And he obviously is saying yes, because Darwin was a racist and all that.
It kind of has to at that point. Yeah.
But there's the scholarship. There's literally a book called Darwin's Sacred Cause, and Darwin in his own writings, whether he was exegetically correct in doing so or not, but still this inspired him. And on top of that, the anti-slavery and all that in his family. With this particular verse in Acts 17, from one blood or one man all comes from. Like, he used that as a means to go, you know what? We are all united, whether you're black or white. And so in other words, it was ironically through his Christian upbringing and the theology and his hatred of the racism and slavery to come up with a theory that says monogenesis is true, not polygenesis. Now, isn't it interesting that scientifically, I mean, yeah, there's a religious side to it, but the science is saying there's unification, not diversification. So therefore, if the so-called satanic science is all about this beautiful model of unification, then why, I hate to say that, but these fundamentalist Christians, they don't seem to realize that they're doing the very thing that they're opposing the so-called science to be doing, which obviously the science is not doing. So they're doing that in their own religious sense, and that's why you may have seen. So Laura and John, you may have seen on my Facebook. I've just sort of been ranting a little bit, but I just got sick and tired of it, and yeah.
Yeah, Elvir.
Can I ask a kind of similar but different question from the National Christian? What then, like, what stops the church from becoming like church nationalism? Aside from like the obvious, there's no specific one land mass. Like what? I guess that's kind of what I was going for with the Christian subculture. Like, what stops the church from being a...
So Jesus answers that to Pilate. If my kingdom is of this world, my servants would fight in order to keep it that way and to keep me from being handed over. And I take that, and Jesus in Matthew goes, don't you realize that I could ask my Father for like 12 legions of angels to do a coup of my own, like that would be a coup. Yeah, that's I look at those little short statements. I'm just like, look, we are in the world. Like, how does the famous saying goes? It's like we're
in the world, not of it is sort of the cliche, right? Yeah. I think, Elvir, if I had to take this on myself, I don't think there is, I don't think there is a Christian culture. Like, I think if, I guess, I think I just see so much space for diversity in Christian thought. And I also particularly see a lot of necessity for Christians to be kind of, to be endlessly critiquing their own circles and their own cultures, right? That's a huge part of it. That, when you look at like the giant mess that the American Southern Baptist Church is in right now, right? That there's a lot of obsessing over external enemies. There's a lot of obsessing over, the critical race theory or feminism, all the things that are going to bring down the church. But you peel back just like a tiny bit of tape on the Southern Baptist Church, and there's just so much rot of racism and sexism and like sex abuse and like all these horrible things that have just been plaguing the church. And so I think, when we're talking about like what is Christian culture right now, that's in it. That's there. There's this sort of like resistance to change, resistance to repentance, resistance to being made rightwise again. So I think if I had explained, say, like what would the ideal Christian culture look like? I think it would be constantly changing. That there's like constantly listening to people who are seeing something prophetically the rest of us are not, and paying attention to those voices. So, I think there's so much. So, if there is any sort of like, I don't think there ever will be or ever should be sort of like a global Christian monoculture. But I think, if I had to pick what churches should look like, I would say that, sort of talking to each other and, looking for where the Spirit is leading and looking for new direction. That's what I would say. Kind of constantly being reformed. So
would
Laura,
Rome qualify as a possible example in reality? And I only say that just because when I'm just kind of thinking in my mind with a virtual-lytics of like, well, which nation would be considered a Christian theocracy? The city-state of Rome is the closest thing I can come to, and I've never been there, so I can't speak to the culture. But I'm just
the Vatican
City
State, yeah,
right.
Yeah. But that's also not, the Vatican City is not
doesn't have an army.
Right, it's not expandable, because people who live in the Vatican City don't like get married and have kids, right?
Not anymore.
What?
Yeah,
no, exactly. There's no Vatican public school system,
Aren't
that's
there private citizens that live in Rome though, right?
Oh yeah, but Rome is not the Vatican State. No, most of Rome is the capital of Italy.
It's like having a Washington D.C. It's not really
right. Yeah, exactly. But there's the Vatican State is within Rome. And people who live within the Vatican State are like the Pope and his retinue. So.
Oh well, then never mind.
Only if people listen to Augustine's City of God, then you can make that argument. So,
right, yeah.
By the way, Laura, what you just said reminded me of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way the seven churches are described in Revelation, how because they're geographically different.
Seven Hills. Oh yeah. Oh, do you mean the seven hills that the beast sits on, or the seven churches at the beginning? Okay.
Chapters 2 and 3. So the individual church has their own problems.
Yeah.
And how when you compile it all, I mean, there are sermons where we can sort of like take an application. Are you
Philadelphia? Are you Laodicea? Yeah. That's always the one everyone thinks you are. Yeah.
But it's sort of similar to that, I think, is what you're getting at, where you can't really nail it down to one particular thing. You have a variety depending on the geography and all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, it should be that way.
Yeah.
My question, sort of for everybody, is where do we think Christian nationalism comes from? Where does it actually
put in the chat?
Yeah, you put some sources in the chat. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, honestly, I don't know the answer to that because this is sort of new to me. But I was looking at the works of Robert Bellah, an American sociologist and professor at University of California, and he gave a list, which I found interesting. But I don't know if this is legit, but this is, again, according to him. You have these themes in American literature like the Revolutionary Wars, the Exodus, Thomas Jefferson and Paine are the prophets, George Washington is Moses, and on it goes.
I would think from just kind of a social perspective, right? I think what's probably injected a lot of that, just again, that whole conflating patriotism with Christianity. I mean, first it starts with the icons, right? We have "In God We Trust" on our money. We have every president ending every formal speech with "God bless the United States of America," right? We have sports, which is very huge in this country, aligned with songs like "God Bless America." And so I think that it's something that can be easy for someone who's naive to fall into the trap of just kind of aligning the two, right? So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
My guess would be like it goes way back to when we first got power.
Yeah, the founding narratives. Yeah.
As soon as power entered the narrative, the church narrative, it just kind of we're basically in the same position Israel was.
Yeah, the question is, when does that actually happen? Because a lot of people appeal to Constantine at this point. This is sort of trendy, and it has been. I'm obviously someone who's been to Duke. We've got Stanley Hauerwas, who fairly recently retired. He's kind of the dude that sort of points to the Constantinian sort of event that ends up sort of giving Christianity power. Is that what you mean, Elvira? Are you going?
I think he was thinking more American founding myths. Am I right, Elvira?
Yeah, I mean, it's a recurring, like, when it entered the narrative, now it's a type, like Christianity is all about types. I think there are wrong types that enter the narrative.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah.
One of them is power. As soon as power entered as a type for the Christian narrative, like, it just repeats itself.
Israel is false typology. That's for sure.
So within Christianity, that would mean wherever sort of essentially supersessionism came into play,
where we have
where we
sacred
read
nation.
Christianity as Israel and as this sort of sacred nation, right?
Yeah.
Over against basically anything else, any other form of life. Yeah.
And then you have the Christendom idea.
But you also have the Crusades and all that sort of stuff too, and colonialism.
Mm-hmm. What were you gonna say?
I don't know. This could take a while.
I was also going to answer it from a geopolitical sense. I don't think that there is a stronger ally in the West to Israel than the United States is, right? And so that's kind of another thing I think a lot of people use is like, we're allies of the Jews. That therefore shows like how much God's ordained us to be their protector and blah, 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 right? So that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, so there's an issue there.
The Christian Zionism idea.
It's the conflation of Israel scripturally and also the nation state of Israel as we know it now. So those two things are different.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about in terms of people conflating this stuff, right? So
No, I think you're definitely right. That like the idea of the United States as like a protector of Israel is, I think, a huge idea in Christian nationalism.
Right.
I think that definitely is there.
Along that line, just to think, like, learning that like the largest supporters of Israel in America are Christians, like above and beyond like most Jewish Americans. Like, I didn't know that for the longest time, and learning that is like very telling of like what that actually means to the like.
I have a kind of funny story on that. I went to Israel, and there's a bunch of shirts. Don't worry, Israel, America's got your back. Well, me and my buddy had a shirt that said, "Don't worry, America, Israel's got your back." And we're like, "Gee, thanks." Like.
That's so creepy. What a rude thing to wear to somebody else's country. That's such a rude thing to wear. So,
I will say in my immediate family, definitely, believe it or not, there seems to be a growing trend in European Christianity of a Zionistic sort of method. And let's just say that I guess you could say, because I was brought up into that, obviously sort of semi-brainwashed into the whole, like, this is again before I became Christian, just this it's spooky, this the 1948 thing and the state of Israel, and there seems to be like a reverence towards it. So in other words, if there's any indication of a different perspective on that, they then insinuate that you're being anti-Semitic. You see, they seem to marry that, and I just want to let everyone know, like outside, that if us as Christians who don't hold to that per se, we're not obviously anti-Semitic. That's just one thing does not lead to the next, but because it's so married to that, and anything anti-Israel is immediately, or anti, in other words, this thing called replacement theology. The church becomes Israel. Ooh, how dare you say that? You're anti-Semitic. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think supersessionism. I think it's a super dicey thing. You know, I think, I don't know. I have my advisor challenged me on this recently about whether or not is all supersessionism anti-Semitic, and I think broadly it usually is. You know, I'd have to like look at, you know, his specific competing examples were all related to like Jewish forms of Christianity, and it's like, okay, fine. But yeah, I don't want to. I don't know how much I want to go down this path of like, you know, because obviously Christian anti-Semitism is a huge topic and also a huge problem.
We did a stream on this.
So, yeah, we did do a stream on this. So yeah, no, but I think because I don't think though, when you have Christian Zionists who are reacting to geopolitics and having this sort of like strong like pro-Israel thing, it's not really like a it often doesn't correspond to like favorable feelings or like favorable policies towards Jews in the United States. Like it's often this very like Israel qua state on the other side of the world that doesn't really have anything to do with the way that we categorize Jews living among us and how we should be respectful of them and how we preach and talk about them in particular. But I also think that there's this, you know, ultimately a lot of this stuff doesn't really have that much to do with wanting good things for even Israel, the state. A lot of it's really just this sort of prophecy-oriented idea, right? You know, the idea that Israel has a certain role to play in the end times, and that this needs to happen, which is actually a very violent fate for a lot of people who live in Israel. So it's a bit of an exploitative view of Israel. So I actually think that a lot of Christian Zionism can be really anti-Semitic, you know, and it's not just as simple as, you know, pro-Israel, fighting anti-Semitism. You know, these are things that
I think for Christian Zionists, Israel is useful within an eschatological kind of framework, right? It does something specific that gets you to the end times.
Right.
There's no integrity of Israel in itself as a people with their practices that we can affirm fully as Christians. It's only as a sort of kind of stepping stone toward an ultimate end, right?
Yeah.
So that's already turning Israel into this sort of like, I don't know if useful thing is the right word,
right.
But like,
an object that is used by the church, which I think is also kind of like classic supersessionism, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And just quickly, what I know I don't want to keep on this topic, but like I'll just be brief and give an example. Like some Ezekiel commentaries I've read, like Arnold Fruchtenbahn is, I guess you could say, from the Hasidic ultra-Orthodox line. He became Christian. His family was suffered in the Holocaust, and so he's Jewish, but he's a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And then in his commentary on Ezekiel at the end, in the millennial kingdom thing in Ezekiel, he literally says, everyone will go back, regardless of what nationality you're in. You will go back to a thoroughly Jewish practice where it goes back to the sacrifices again and all that. In the new creation. And I'm just thinking to myself, what the heck am I like? Yeah, that makes no sense. Why would God need to go back into that primitive thing? And but
no, that's actually a fair question, because, like, you know, in a lot of Judaism is overwhelmingly not dependent on the sacrifice system now, right? You know, like after the destruction of the Second Temple, you know, Judaism sort of was rebuilt around like the rabbis and text study and prayer. Like those are a lot. The synagogue is, you know, very much like the loci of Jewish practice now. So that's actually, and I also think that kind of, it goes up a little bit against how other Jewish writers think about restoration, which and all this can really play into the way we talk about like what would be like Christian culture, you know. A lot of the stuff was, I think, modeled for us, interestingly, by early Jewish and early Jewish Christian writers who had a really strong sense of the idea that the eschaton is an era of some level of plurality, you know. So you see in Isaiah, like the Feast of the Nations in Isaiah 25, you have this eschatological inclusion of Gentiles, but they're not circumcised, right? They are participants in their own right. And then in the animal apocalypse in First Enoch, very classic early Jewish apocalypse, everybody goes, so it's a whole like depiction of the story of Israel told through animals, where the patriarchs are cows, and then Jacob, his descendants are sheep, and then everybody else is birds or bears or wolves. But at the end of everything, everybody becomes a cow again. Right. So it's not that everyone becomes a sheep, which is interesting, because that would suggest that everyone gets incorporated into Israel. Everyone kind of goes back to this idealized pre-differentiation state. So those are two really different views of what happens to culture. But it's interesting that for the most part, Jews or early Jews didn't really, and these are the people who, of course, like Paul was drawing on, right? And who Mark was drawing on, because all these guys are coming from this culture. The idea that the salvation of the world comes through incorporation into one national identity wasn't really something people seem to think. So I think that's really interesting. But
Is
Avi
that
Schwartz wants to talk. Yeah, sorry.
Oh no, okay, yeah, no, go for it. No,
Avi Schwartz wants to talk more about supersessionism. What do you want to talk about, Avi? Sorry, yeah.
Oh, in the chat, yeah. I was just going to say, is that connected to in Ephesians 2 or 3, where Paul says, out of the both groups, he made one new humanity.
Yeah.
And all that language. Yeah.
Yeah, that broke down the dividing wall.
2:11 through 22.
Yeah.
Ephesians,
Yeah.
I mean, Romans 11 is good on this stuff too.
Yeah, the branch and the
9
trees.
11, really.
Yeah.
I think it's doing similar stuff.
I
Yeah.
know.
Go ahead, Ilver.
Well, I brought it up jokingly in that other video you, me, and Spartan were on. But the question is, why is God Jewish? And it's a question I take from Paula Friedrichsen,
Right.
her Paul book, Apostle of the Pagans.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, she paints a very thoroughly Jewish Paul and a very Jewish God and a very Jewish Messiah. I mean, that's something I don't know really how to square with, or if it needs I don't know. Yeah. Sorry.
So I say from a Christian perspective, I think it's Paul. You don't support the root supports you, right? There's this sort of this basically I like adoption idea to some extent. But then, as Paula Fredrickson's Why is God Jewish? Deuteronomy has an interesting answer on this front, which is sort of complicated from a militaristic perspective when we're talking about these issues, is that they were the smallest of the nations, right? Israel's the smallest of the nations, and it's this sort of God loves an underdog story, right?
Yeah.
I think that's
one guy.
Sorry?
I said it started from one guy, and that's
and I think that's a really interesting answer in Deuteronomy. And of course, like a lot of this stuff is coming out of a post-exilic context when people are trying to make sense of basically national tragedy and national disaster. And the idea that God loves an underdog is sort of a theologically rich idea in that environment. So, yeah. But are we getting some
Yeah, I'm just trolling.
Yeah, Avi wants to ask whether supersessionism inescapably anti-Semitic. I'm not. It would be really great to have a Jewish person in the room for this conversation, but I guess we have Avi, but he's in the chat, so I think.
Would you mind defining what that means? What is supersessionism?
Sure, supersessionism is the idea that the church has taken some sort of place as the locus of God's activity, the salvation, that salvation history works in the church in a way that used to work through Israel. It's very, very difficult, I think, to say that with that, why is it anti-Semitic? One is, I guess to some extent it challenges at least some classic claims that Jewish writers make about, that Jewish scripture has made about itself, that there is something special and chosen about Israel that is irrevocable. I I think the biggest challenge is that it's very difficult to make some kind of a supersessionistic claim that doesn't implicitly or explicitly claim that God has rejected Israel because of Israel's bad behavior. And that is a very anti-Semitic myth, right? You know, the idea that, like, God forbid, you know, that Israel killed Jesus, right? Or something like that. Or like the hard-heartedness idea that this is this enduring problem. So there's often some very anti-Semitic myths caught up in it. So that's pretty dicey. But I do think you do have a kind of supersessionism, I think, in early Jewish renewal movements, right? You know, like the Qumran community, or Matthew's gospel even, or like Paul and the disciples. I think you have groups of, people who think of themselves as renewal movements within Israel that have this sort of like special Israel within Israel role, which is loosely supersessionistic, but maybe not really Paul, I guess, but like Qumran and Matthew, I would put in that
I don't know
category.
Paul does that. Paul's pretty clear that God's promises to Israel
are
irrevocable.
He says that's his literal words.
He
literally
says that.
For
and
sure.
He also has a conception in Romans 11 that all of Israel
will be saved.
Even though there is a sort of temporary hardening that's going on, whatever that might look like, in which sort of this sort of motley spread of unnatural branches, which are Gentiles, get sort of grafted onto the tree of Israel. That hardening and that breaking off is not final. He's very clear about that. There is a continued integrity and importance of historical Israel and their practices right throughout the text. He doesn't erase Israel. I think part of supersessionism, and Avi may actually push back on me on this, I think part of what supersessionism does is it's an erasure of Jewish practices in their integrity as practices, especially when you have Jews in the church and you say, no, you got to keep that stuff out of the church. Once you come in, you can't keep observing your Jewish practices when you're in the church. I don't think we have any sort of justification for saying that. The issue is when that's applied to Gentiles. Yeah. And Gentiles have to become Torah observant.
Yeah. Which Paul
members
was
of the
thought was double plus ungood.
Like
so yeah.
Right. But I really don't think Paul is a supersessionist. I know that there are certain schools of thought in Paul that think that he is inevitably a supersessionist. That's fine. Just think they're wrong. Name some names.
You're just biased.
Yeah. And I guess, I'm always trying to think about this with like a bit of an eye towards like establishing plurality, which I definitely hear Avi saying, here. But I think that, why does this matter and why does this stuff come up when we talk about culture and nationalism is I think that it is generally good for Christianity to cultivate its theology in a direction in which, and this is to some extent at odds with, claims that are made that Israel makes about itself in the Old Testament. I think it is generally good for theology to cultivate an understanding of a community that does not favor any particular national group or culture over others. So I think this is something that I see being negotiated a lot in the New Testament is like, so should you be circumcised or not? Should you, can you worship idols or not? Are idols part of your cultural identity? Is that something we need to preserve? Should Gentiles follow Torah? Are when you get to like Romans in the tree and the tree supporting the root, is there a special level of like honor that Jewish Christian churches should be afforded by virtue of being kind of the roots of this? So I think there's some tough questions there with honoring particularity without it becoming definitive for identity. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. One sec. Yeah, this is important, and we can kind of. I know that Elvira, you were wanting to say something on this.
Yeah.
But this is worth a longer conversation, and I think we can possibly talk about this more. I mean, it is very important. Yes, there are truth claims that Jews make about Christians that aren't particularly nice, and I think it's vice versa too.
Oh yeah,
I think
absolutely.
some of the stuff about Jesus being the Lord is not going to sit well with some Jewish people who aren't responding to that, and that's okay. That doesn't mean I don't think the claim that Jesus is the Lord is necessarily supersessionist, because it's not in and of itself wiping out Jewish practices or their identity as Jewish people. It doesn't. It can, used in certain ways, but in and of itself, I don't think that's true. So yeah, we're going to have some difficult conversations among Jews and Christians, pagan Christians in particular. Most of whom, I think all of us are Gentile Christians, yeah. But how that works out practically, yeah, that's a great question.
Can I just offer like a blunt how I see it, and again, you can tell me if you agree or not, but I see Christianity as a fulfilled Judaism, or in this case, like a Second Temple Judaism, right? But an accomplished, fulfilled, like this is it. As far as a theological system goes, not at all married or connected to a geographical perception, because for the Great Commission to be true, and when Jesus says starting in Jerusalem, then going to the ends of the earth, like in Acts 1, like the fact that he's even saying that means he's wanting a type of like global Eden sort of mandate to take place, rather than some let's make the whole world Israel or something like.
Yeah,
that's how I'm perceiving it.
I get super squirrely about language of completed Judaism because I don't like the implication Judaism's unfinished.
No, I think there is room for fulfillment, right? I don't think it's fulfilled in Christianity per se. I think it is fulfilled in Christ specifically.
Basically, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, Jesus is the one.
Yeah, so those are two. I think that's an important distinction, though, to make, because Christ is a Jew. He doesn't stop being a Jew. It's fulfilled in that Jewish person. So that if we're saying, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I think there is a kind of uncareful way of saying that it's fulfilled in Christianity, and by that we mean Gentile Christians or pagan Christians. That's a problem. If we're saying that it's fulfilled in Christ specifically as a Jew, I think even though a lot of Jewish people would be unhappy with that, I don't see that as being specifically supersessionist. I don't see that as erasing Jewish practices. I don't see that as erasing anything that comes before, right?
And that
so I'm concerned with erasure
as well.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Here's a question from you guys in terms of just a marketing perspective, and maybe ties into the Christian nationalism in a little bit of a different nuance. So what do you guys, well, let me phrase the question correctly. Do you think that a Jew who identifies as a Messianic Jew is in a sense being a nationalist because they want to align their Jewish roots with, in this case, Christianity?
You'd have to ask them.
But I also think there's an extent to which, like, all of us have a cultural and national identity that probably precedes our Christianity. Like a lot of us were something before we were Christian, or came out as something while we were Christian. So, I think on one hand, you're like, yeah, a Messianic Jew is preserving Jewish traditions and living a Jewish culture. But I also celebrate Thanksgiving. Like I am an American Christian. And I think that when we're talking about this particularism and the way that Paul and other writers are navigating this in early Christianity, I think this particularity is not necessarily, I think it's not something Christians are trying to get rid of. I don't think that's the ideal. I don't think we're trying to get rid of our particular Christianity. It's like I'm always going to be white, no matter what happens, right? And like that will affect the way I go through the world. That will affect the way that I experience life in America. I'm always going to be American. That always is going to be there, and I don't think you can get rid of it. I think the question is it putting pressure on your faith in a way that makes you incapable of certain forms of response to the Spirit, right? I think that's the issue. So,
yeah.
I have a question. So like we talked about, the point isn't to make everyone Jewish, right? Like that's what it was.
Yeah, Paul would be upset about that. Yeah.
My question is the goal to make everyone church? Like, is the point of the church to be the whole world, or like, is that the eschatological end, or does the church serve a purpose almost remnant like within does that make sense?
yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. This is bringing up a really important ecclesiological question. Very basic one. What do we mean by what does it mean to be the church, right? I think for us in this time, where we're situated in the sort of overlap of the ages, as it were, between the old age and the new, the final consummation of all things. That's where we're located. I think the church is meant to be the people who are responding faithfully to Jesus and witnessing to him in the present, in how we act and how we live and how we speak and how we relate to one another, how we worship, all of those sorts of things, how we especially how we relate to people and how we're speaking about Christ, right? Though that's the church right now. I think the eschatological vision is beyond that. I think it's beyond the church. I think the church is, in some sense, something that we're a part of in this age, right? I think when we get to the final consummation of all things, I wouldn't call that the church. I would call that being a participant in the very life of God fully and completely. Theosis, as Rob would call it.
Yes.
There's being fully drawn into the life of God, where there isn't something called the church anymore. The church is a specific instantiation of people who are witnessing to Jesus Christ right now. It's just, I mean, this is a very kind of specific Protestant understanding of it. So like Catholics would disagree with me on this because I'm not talking about sort of institutions or the sort of presentation of the Eucharist, right, around which we come together. I'm not really talking about that stuff. That's important, but I think it's where we're witnessing to and coming together in community to do that sort of work. So
could it be said the point at which the church ends is when the sacraments are no longer necessary?
You could say that.
John's not sacramental at all.
I'm the wrong person to ask about this because I'm just confused about. I mean, coming from a Duke context.
Do you get what I'm kind of?
I get what you mean.
Right. I think that's actually a really great question.
I think that makes sense.
Doesn't Jesus say that?
Yes.
Though?
What's that?
Huh?
Do this until I return, sort of thing.
Yeah, whenever
Like,
you drink,
the cup.
yeah.
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 It gives that implication, right? Like,
sure.
Right.
Like,
I will not drink this again.
words,
I'll drink it anew. Yeah.
because I see that as just a toast. I don't see that spiritually. I see that as do this in remembrance, like a toast, and we honor Jesus, reverence, all that stuff. So it's a psychological.
Pour one out for
thing, right?
Jesus.
Well, of course, it was originally it was a meal, right?
Yeah, it's a big meal. Yeah,
it was a meal that you ate together, and then you would break bread and pass around the cup in that meal together, right? So it didn't have the sort of same ritualistic sort of meaning that it does now, which it's fine. I'm totally cool with people
that
who
the
have
meal
it
literally becomes the flesh and blood. Like,
yeah, and that's fine. I'm cool with that. I don't personally believe that about what the elements are, but yeah, I think once that sort of fellowship around Christ's table ends, that's the end of our history. That's the end of history. And we're entering into the eschaton to be fully
and then
involved
the real meal is
to
Leviathan,
the point at
right?
which we're in God right? We're in God at that point. And also God is in us in a way that we were anticipating with the eating of the elements. God is in us fully, and we're in God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I transition the conversation to political theology?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure.
Just-
How much time do you have left?
Let's say maybe like 10 more minutes,
Yeah.
and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, do we have questions in the chat? I'm okay to just do that.
I don't know. I mean,
I have something I could bring up that's like kind of probably quicker than a whole conversation on political theology. But
the
something
answer
I've
to
been
you,
kind of
Elvira, is no.
you got denied. No, I don't know. I'm not taking control of the stream, so tell me.
All right, now we got to do it on your channel.
Yeah, that's fine. But something I've been kind of thinking about is like I feel like some of this, like this is kind of whatever, starting from scratch a little bit, but some of these whole like Christian nationalism claims, I feel like has to come from like this more modern view of like inerrancy and like trying to clear up all these issues in scripture where people try and say like, this is what the Bible says about this. So like they try and apply things so universally that like as I learn more, realize like are not meant to be applied so universally at all. Like especially someone like Nick Quint, who I've been talking to, where he talks a lot about like women pastors and stuff, and how he talks about like he doesn't believe that there is like a biblical ecclesiology, but there is like multiple ecclesiologies and stuff. And like I think you rarely hear that from like everyday people. I'm sure more in academia, that's obviously not like a wild claim or anything, but especially in like every day, it's like everybody thinks they're right and everybody would be better off if they listened to them. And I think that's where a lot of this like Christian nationalism comes from, because it's like, oh, well, there's so many Christians in America. We know we're right about all this stuff, so other people are just wrong. Like it's impossible that like we're both right. And I think that has a lot to do with a lot of this. Like people don't
There's
like
like an
this.
anti-plurality.
Yeah. Especially like, I don't know if like you guys saw, I follow a lot of like random channels and stuff, and like that like random thing with like Steve Harvey or whatever. People are like freaking out because this guy said like, I don't know, he like is like a Muslim and a Christian or something. Like I don't really even know what he said, but like,
I have no idea.
yeah, apparently he's like, I don't know, like he just like it's like a religious pluralist or whatever, essentially. Which I know that's not what we're talking about, but just
you
like
can't be bound.
yeah, exactly. Just like this idea that like, there is a clear answer to everything, and I think people are really latching onto that. At least like from what I can tell, you know, I haven't studied history as much, so I don't know like how much this is just now or it's always been this way or whatever, but like people definitely don't like gray areas and like blurry lines where, and I think that has a lot to do with this whole Christian nationalism.
No, I think you're right. I think this is where a lot of fundamentalisms come from, right? Is like a need to resist pluralism, a need to resist multiculturalism and liberalism in sort of like the classical pluralistic individualized sense. I think that's definitely what's happening there. And I think that, you know, sort of making this sort of uncomplicated view of, you know, like making your country all one thing and your religion all one thing, and this is all inherently good, you know, is I get the appeal in a really complicated society where there's a lot of really challenging questions about how to integrate different cultures into one another, and you know how to assimilate refugees, whether to assimilate refugees, or whether or not assimilation is a worthwhile goal for people. I think those are really what? No, exactly right. Yeah, exactly. I think these are, you know, these are incredibly complicated questions, and I think that there's sort of a warm bath feeling of fundamentalisms in the face of this. So yeah,
this is making me realize. So yeah. I'm definitely gonna have to make a video follow up to this about what I think of as the origins of
No, I want
Christian
you to do that
nationalism, 'cause
show on Willie
actually-
Jennings.
I actually
yeah.
I actually do think race has a lot of. It's come up a couple times in this discussion. Race. Usually, when we think of race, we think of a particular sort of thing, usually to do with specific identities of people, whether sort of self-claimed identities or things that are imposed on other people. I do think that race plays a central part in the formation of Christian nationalism historically. So I would need to give a kind of historical narrative of this, and I definitely going to do that. And what I'm realizing I want to say is that Christian nationalism is actually an instantiation of a long history of a certain sort of racial imagination that comes out of Christian colonialism specifically. I think it's coming out of that place. I think that's really where the roots of Christian nationalism come from, and it's a difficult story. It's a complicated one, and hopefully I can make it simple. But yeah, just as a teaser, I think that's where I'm going to go. In the light of sort of historical.
Maybe we could do
by-
another discussion group
yeah.
after you make that.
especially in the light
Yeah.
of a lot of really wonderful work by Willie Jennings,
Yeah.
who's at Yale, J.K. McCarter, who's at IU, was at Duke.
Yeah. Go Hoosiers.
Some other folks who were involved in that.
The
sort
other
of
book I was
discussion.
thinking
Yeah.
about a lot while we were talking was Richard T. Hughes's Myths America Lives By. I think that's a really good text for, where not just Christian nationalism, but where American identity comes from. And and again, like myths are not an inherently bad thing,
Right.
but they certainly can be if they are if they're a storytelling supporting device or something. Jesus and John Wayne, Vincent Artal just mentioned that one.
She got Heretic of the Year
All
award.
From who?
You'll see it on Twitter if you dig deeper.
Okay.
We're gonna try to get her on the
I'm gonna
show.
try. Yeah,
Your
Dr.
face is on there, and it's from this guy. I don't even know him. I don't friend him, so
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, I've interacted with her a few times on social media, and I'd love to.
She's
recruit-
aware of it, so
Well, yeah, no, I'm sure. We've been wanting to have her on the show, Dr. Dumay. I thought Jesus and John Wayne was just great. I loved it. So I particularly watching people read Jesus and John Wayne was a real trip. I think that Christianity Today review is just one of the most infamous things they've ever printed, and that was. Did you read that?
No.
That was wild. So,
I'll need to look into this. I don't know about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to look at it too. Yeah. How about I want to do a part 2 of this kind of discussion, and I'll put out a video of sort of where I'm.
yeah,
coming
do
from.
sort of like Christian nationalism and white
and
supremacy.
sort of race
and
stuff.
race.
Because
yeah.
what I don't want to do, and what the book that Laura is using, the Perry and Whitehead book, is we don't want to reduce this conversation to
descriptive now.
to race as defined in sort of individualistic, even communal terms here and now. But there is a discussion of race that's in a more kind of broader context that I'd like to bring in, that some theorists are doing, that may be helpful. So I'd love to get y'all's take on that at some point. Yeah, because it's probably going to sound very different than what you're probably used to when hearing about race. But yeah, if y'all are up for that. But I don't know if we have any actual questions other than Avi.
Do you mind if I ask a quick one to Rob? Maybe he said it earlier, but
go for
I'm sorry if I missed it. It was, and I put it in our StreamYard chat. But Rob, I was curious because since you're not even an American, is there any type of that like Christian plus patriot equals godly happening in your culture over there?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So Australia, coming from the Commonwealth of England, and so we're still under the Queen, all that stuff, and technically in the sense the Church of England, so Anglican derivation, but we've definitely become a lot more plural. So I came here in '97. Even back then, I remember I'm just shotgunning here. Like say 70 or 80% of the Australian population was like Christian. Now it's in the mid 50s%. Purely because of multiculturalism that's come in, and in other words, we're a very welcoming nation. But I guess you could say patriotic in the sense of not because of this abstract like Australia and then the flag, even though that's special and all that, but it's we don't look at it that way. We look at it more like we are after quality, not quantity, if you sort of can see it that way. And in this sense, quality in the sense of everything, in anything you do, whether it's in sports, in academics, and social stuff. And don't forget, this is also rooted in, and how interesting and ironic, and sort of paradoxical as well, the convicts that came from England.
Yeah.
This notion of mateship. So hey mate, is because, and I hate to say this, but it's just a fact of history. You had like 20 men to like 2 women back in those days, which because it's they're just prisoners off boats, and you can well imagine what the women where they stood in relation to how they were used and seen and so on. And then that's slowly, because of that, and don't forget, there's on top of that you have the Aborigine situation going on, so there's that racial tension there. So believe it or not, the church that then finally took their root in Australian culture, slowly over time made literally sanctified everyone here. So basically the worst of the worst coming out of England became, and this is sort of kind of like there is literally an England versus Australia tension here, where
the national founding story.
Yeah, the worst of the worst became much better than England themselves. Basically, that's how Australians see it. And then we've become totally opposite of how Australia did start. And it's all about, just going back to what I just said a moment ago, it's all about quality over quantity in everything you do. And so you're open to practice your religion, but do it not just to the best of ability, but notice that thing I just said a moment ago, mateship, where your mate can sort of benefit from that somehow, and vice versa.
Yeah. All right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Love it. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
I feel like I learned a lot.
For joining
Yeah,
this stream.
absolutely.
This is great. We went from Christian nationalism. We talked about anti-Semitism. We talked about
all these things are very
stuff.
interrelated,
of course they
right?
Are. Yeah,
Like I feel like you can't talk
John,
about any of this.
Yeah.
For the second video, I know we're gonna go heavily on race discussions, but will we? I feel like we didn't really hit too much on like politics.
No, I think that's a really good. Yeah,
of course we can bring that up. Yeah, I mean that's gonna be intertwined with that discussion.
I have some questions I was dying to ask. But,
the way that I'm going to narrate that
not on too long,
it's
so
definitely going to be conducive to political, sort of theological questions, or that I'm planning to. I don't have it. Don't really know what I'm going to say. This was just very helpful for me to kind of
figure out what you want to move in on it.
Because I've always been interested in sort of the because the Whitehead and Perry book doesn't talk about where Christian nationalism really comes from, its origins, its history. It talks about it more as this sort of neutral, essentially data that we can get sociologically. And then evaluate things analytically, which has its place,
right? Yeah,
because then we can make sense of certain things that are happening in our context, right? But I'm curious about where this actually comes from, and also, what are we supposed to do about it as Christians? If Christian nationalism is a problem, right? If it is a problem, what do we do? What resources can we draw from to actually give a kind of solution to that? And I think we understand the history behind it, which is, of course, going to be the Bible, in part. But also certain theological reflections on the Bible as well, which is, of course, what we do all the time. right?
No.
Yeah. What were you pointing at?
Huh?
Were you pointing at something?
Oh no,
Okay.
I don't think so. I was just working on my pineapple.
You might have stretched your hand up. Anyway, thank you guys for doing this. This
Thanks
was
so
really
much.
great.
Great to see
I
everybody.
enjoyed this
Thank you.
time. And
Thank
thank you everyone who
Cool.
tuned in for the live chat. With that, this has been Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with.
Have a great night,
See you, everyone.
everybody. Take care.
Good night.
America.